interested in the question of how people defend computer systems. How, as a defender, you look at your system and think about what do you want to stop or block or constrain in various ways. And the challenge that I want to start from today is the question of how you distinguish between malicious and legitimate activity on a computer system. How do you think as a defender about this is malicious or this is sufficiently risky that it needs to be given some extra scrutiny, it needs to be blocked in some way. We have a lot of identity indicators that we use to make some of those distinctions, lists of domains or IP addresses or certificates that we have prior experience to know are malicious that we want to block from our systems. What really interests me are the question of what are the behavioral indicators that you can use or add to those identity indicators to think about these are behaviors that are really suspicious, that seem malicious or seem likely enough to be malicious that we need to take a little bit of extra care with them. And a couple of the ways I've been thinking about that recently have to do one with volume as a general pattern for thinking about types of behavior you want to deal with. What happens when you see an activity that is usually legitimate or certainly legitimate lots of the time, but you're seeing it in such high volume, something like a denial of service attack or a dictionary attack. You're seeing so many login attempts, so many requests for a web server, that actually makes it seem more malicious. One of the other patterns has to do with exfiltration when you look at outbound traffic and the question of, is that in itself sometimes so harmful, even though there are lots of legitimate reasons for sending outbound traffic, that it requires some extra level of scrutiny. And what really interests me in trying to approach this challenge is how do you combine the identity indicators and the behavioral indicators? How do you use them to reinforce each other? So I want to talk about a couple models for thinking about how you might do that, and certainly solicit others either in the extra time or afterwards from all of you. One of the models that interests me is whether you can actually use identity indicators to build some reputation for the resources, the actors who you don't know. Right? Receiving an email from somebody who you've never corresponded with by email before could be totally fine, could be an email you want to receive, could be the beginning of something malicious, potentially. Can you use the certificate or the signature attached to that email to actually build up a reputation before you grant that identity indicator some of the behaviors that could be more malicious? So for instance, you say, I'm willing to receive emails from people whose signatures I've never seen before, but I'm not willing to receive emails that have attachments or URLs in them until I've communicated with that actor at least once. And then, once they've built up that reputation, once I've responded to them or we've had some baseline level of interaction, I'm willing to allow them these more risky capabilities to engage with these activities that I know may be legitimate, but I also know introduce more risk into my system. So building reputation for identity indicators is one of the models that interests me. Another is whether you can use behavioral indicators or restrictions to actually enforce the accuracy of those identity indicators. This is sort of the model of the CAN-SPAM Act in some ways, the way I think about it, where they say, okay, it's legal to send commercial bulk email, but it's not legal to do that while you're forging the header of your email or while you're using an open relay. So you're trying to constrict the activity, admittedly, not terribly successfully, in a way that actually enforces the accuracy of those identity indicators. And that can mean a couple things. It can mean that there's more accountability, potentially, if you have an identity indicator that you think you can trace back to an actual actor. It also makes those identity indicators, and this is true of the reputational approach as well, less replaceable for an adversary. If somebody wants to conduct a lot of phishing attacks, but first they have to build up this reputation with their recipients, then each individual signature that they create, each account, is harder to build up, requires more work on their part, requires more investment of their resources. So that's a lot of the ideas behind building defenses that interest me. How do you make it a little bit more work to do something malicious? How do you make it just that little bit harder so you can dissuade at least some level of malicious actor? Finally, I think there's a related idea to the reputational approach, which is based around trying to trigger or flag anomalous behaviors for your known indicators, right? That was a way of thinking about what do I do about the people or the resources that I've never interacted before? How do I force them to build up reputation? There's a flip side of that, which is what do I do with the resources, the credentials that I do know, the logins for people who work for me or legitimately use my system, when I see them doing things that they don't usually do, acting from IP addresses that they don't usually log in from. sending data to servers or recipients that don't usually communicate with them.